From the Book of Holy Kings, the Arthurian Roman Empire, Ambrosius, Arthur and Prester John, circa 410 AD to 535. 1. Speaking mind to mind. If the Britons, shorn of Roman assistance now, had only the Saxons to contend with, then they may still have won out. The 3rd century fortifications along the eastern seaboard served them well in this respect, but the Picts, swarming over Hadrian's Wall at will, threatened the country's integrity in a way that the still purely piratical Saxons did not. The British lacked the capacity to fight on multiple fronts, however, so a council of princes was held in 447 to thrash out a strategy. Now there were 2 dominant voices at this council, Vortigern, whose territory lay in North Wales, and Ambrosius, who reigned in the far southwest. Ambrosius longed to restore the link with Rome, and if that could not be done, if the Eternal City was now too weak to offer meaningful assistance, then to make the island of Britain, as much as might be possible, a mini-imperium in and of itself. Ambrosius was steeped in Roman thought, Roman principles and Roman culture. He was a Christian who believed that the empire had been ordained by God as the cradle within which Christianity could grow and flourish. He read and reflected continually on the ancient founding stories, how Aeneas had steered the Trojans to Italy, and how his great-grandson Brutus had brought that seed and spirit to Britain. Romanitas, for Ambrosius, was not a set of customs and traditions that ought to be restored, but a dynamic, multi-layered reality, powered by the hand of God, which absolutely had to shape and inform political life. Vortigern, Ambrosius's rival, was cut from a very different cloth, an ambitious Celtic chieftain whose people had arrived in Britain after the Trojans, but prior to the Romans. He cared not a fig for either Brutus or Aeneas, and he viewed Rome's departure as a chance for Britain to fashion its own identity and become a sovereign, self-sufficient state. But that could not be done all at once. Vortigern suggested a tactical alliance with the Saxons as a first step, offering them the Isle of Thanet off the Kentish coast as a base and employing them as mercenaries against the Picts. Moved by his oratory, his fellow leaders agreed to the plan, as did the Saxons, and for 8 years all went well. But when the mission had been accomplished and it was time to go back home, Hengist, the Saxon war leader, refused to leave. He was thinking in terms of long-term settlement now, and he demanded wider lands and a permanent continuation of the annual allowance Vortigern gave his men. In 456, Vortigern married Hengist's daughter, hoping thereby to formalise and cement the pact between Briton and Saxon. He handed Hengist the whole of Kent as well, and for a decade and a half it appeared that his policy of accommodation was again bearing fruit. But he was naive in the extreme, blinded by hatred of Rome and puffed up with his fantasy of an independent Britain. Hengist had been biding his time and bringing more men over from Denmark and Germany all the while, Angles and Jutes as well as Saxons. In the summer of 473 he showed his hand, bursting out of Kent and breaking the power of the British army. Vortigern retreated to North Wales, and the whole land lay open to the Saxons, apart from the corner held by Ambrosius. The Great Saxon Breakout was a time of unparalleled trauma, but also a moment of collective awakening. With men slaughtered like cattle and women and children hauled off into slavery, people remembered the virtues of Ambrosius, the dignity of his manner, the discipline of his soldiers, and the safe, well-run towns and villages of his domain. There was, it seemed, something to be said for the old Roman ways after all. Warriors who survived the Saxon surge flocked to his standard, and Ambrosius was soon poised to strike. First he took out Vortigern and his remaining followers, then moved against the Saxons and drove them back to Kent. He paused in London, and men wondered how far he would pursue the foe, and whether he intended to push him into the sea. Then Blaise, the Grail priest, came up from Glastonbury on the morning of the autumn solstice. He took Ambrosius to the White Tower and led him down a secret stairway to where the head of Bran the Blessed lay in the cavern carved by the survivors of the ancient Irish War. and it seemed to Ambrosius in the stillness of that chamber that the king spoke mind to mind with him, advising him how to address the populace who were waiting for his proclamation up above in the September sun. So Ambrosius returned and sat down in the high place, with his brother Uther to his right and Uther's son Arthur to his left. He was crowned King of Britain at noon by blaze, and stood before the people and declared, "Men and women of Troia Nova, this is as far as we go. The reconquest of Kent is a task for my successors. Our ships shall patrol the channel, and we will not allow the enemy to add reinforcements. But we will take the fight no further. We need to rebuild and restructure and restore the peace and security we knew under Rome. And we will succeed in this, I assure you. I will not assume the purple. I will not march on Rome. I am neither Carausius nor Magnus Maximus, and I am certainly not Constantine. I am a king, not an emperor. I am Ambrosius. And though the empire be now but a shadow, I will bring the Pax Romana back again to these shores." Lords and commoners alike rejoiced in his solidity, and Ambrosius was true to his word for 15 years until he left this world. He laid a foundation, and those that came after, particularly Arthur, built on that platform to stunning effect. 2. The desolation of Arthur. Ambrosius was succeeded by Uther, his brother, who picked up cudgels against the Saxons and drove hard into Kent, pushing them back to the coast. He wanted them out, and was conscious that somewhere on that Saxon-held shore, deep within a cave, lay the bronze horse of Brutus, containing the holy statues that Aeneas had rescued from Troy. Uther knew that Brutus had buried it well, but he also knew that the Saxons, should they discover it, would be hugely boosted, as the Greeks had been when Odysseus stole the Luck of Troy, the Palladium, while the Trojans slept, divesting the city of heavenly protection and dooming it to destruction. But Uther was killed in battle, and Arthur, his son, was crowned High King in London. Arthur was brave, charismatic, visionary, and dynamic. He formed a mobile cavalry unit of 300 men, clad from top to toe in mail. They rode from place to place at lightning pace, and the barbarians had no answer to their speed and skill. His fame blazed across Europe like a comet, and the finest men of the time, energised by his example, rushed across the Channel to join him. The Scots were sent back to Ireland, the Picts forced up into the Highlands, and the Saxons, Jutes and Angles driven out entirely. A Te Deum was sung at Glastonbury St Mary's, and Arthur was given a second coronation at Paternoster Square in York as Roman Emperor. After 40 years, he announced, an imperator is once more in situ in the west. Some lieutenants urged him to take back Gaul and march on Rome, but Arthur declined. "Rome is Britain now," he replied, "and Britain Rome. We alone in the west stood fast against the enemy. We alone kept faith with Brutus and Aeneas. We are an alter imperium, and I will not risk our future on overseas jaunts, for I must ensure that the Roman fire burns here still 1,000 years from now." Arthur built a mighty army and a first-rate fleet, but his purposes were purely defensive. "I am not a conqueror," he snapped at those chieftains agitating for war still. "I am a guardian and protector." He took this calling so seriously that he had Bran the Blessed's head brought up from its chamber and cast out upon the sea. "I am the bearer of the island," he bellowed, "and I alone am responsible for its security. Bran has done his work and done it well. The torch is now passed on to me." Arthur's success had gone to his head, and megalomania was starting to creep in. But he was a genius nonetheless, a champion and an innovator who invested not just in arms, but in churches, cathedrals, hospitals, schools, universities, and all manner of glorious enterprises that made Britain the wonder of the West. Yet his reign had a shadow side, rule with a rod of iron, which Arthur called the price of unity, but which many nobles found limiting and oppressive. He demanded high standards in public and private life, and those who fell short were flung into the imperial dungeon. Frustrated by the glory denied them by Arthur's refusal to wage war, some worldly-minded lords started to grumble against him. Rumours concerning his childless marriage to Gwenhwyvar of Gwent began to circulate. It was whispered that she preferred Lancelot of the Lake, the emperor's right-hand man. Speculation swirled that Mordred, chief of the dissenters, was the product of an incestuous liaison between Arthur and his sister, Morgause. Mordred himself did nothing to deny such gossip, as it served his wider purpose of undermining the Arthurian regime. It was easy for him, in a climate of growing discord, to promise the dissatisfied, in the event of his taking power, the cheap glory, material gain, and luxurious lifestyles they felt entitled to. Mordred knew how to hurt Arthur too. He knew how devoted he was to Our Lady of Glastonbury and to the Holy Grail. Arthur made frequent pilgrimage to St. Mary's, receiving counsel from Nations, the Grail priest. So, Mordred stole the Grail, carrying it north on Midsummer's Eve to a woodland fortress in a remote, well-concealed place. From there he watched and waited, knowing exactly how events would unfold. And as he had foreseen, Arthur's loyalists, Galahad, Lancelot, Percival, Bors, and many more, left London at once, splitting into separate directions in search of the Grail. Saxons and other undesirables had been sneaking back of late, and Britain was no longer safe terrain to freely ride around in. Mordred rejoiced and sent word to his supporters, instructing them to stay in the city. With his friends gone and surrounded by foes, Arthur discerned that should he leave his capital for an instant, then one of Mordred's lackeys would straightway seize control, keeping the throne warm, as it were, for his master's return from the north. But Mordred wanted more. Night after night he sat alone with the Grail, bending it to his will and turning it against the Emperor. He unleashed psychic war on Arthur, and the great bear's mind cracked beneath the strain. He ran screaming out of London, while Mordred's followers raised the black flag of Baphomet, the one deity Mordred served, from the tower's highest battlements. Arthur was a broken reed, haunting the southern marches and hunting in vain for the bronze horse of Brutus and the healing, regenerative images of the gods. In a midnight storm on a blasted heath, he bared his breast to the elements and cried out to Bran, begging forgiveness for his rashness and pride. He sought the legendary tunnels too, that Constantine himself was said to have built, but naught did he find, save rock and stone and water that tasted like lead. Mordred sent missives to the army and navy, declaring a national emergency and naming himself supreme commander. He ordered a black mass to be celebrated at Glastonbury. Then he picked up the Grail, gathered his servants about him, and stepped out onto the Great South Road. And it was night. 3. A light this day shall shine upon us. The quest of a Holy Grail took a grievous toll on Arthur's companions. Lancelot, Galahad, Tristram, Gawain, all were dead. 6 months after Mordred's theft, only Percival and Bors remained. Together they crisscrossed the north, sensing that the Grail was close by. A woman of power rode with them, Dindrain, the sister of Percival, a holy nun of Almesbury. Early on Christmas morn, while it was still dark, they came upon Mordred and his men at a standing stone near Carlisle, and there was war between Dindrain and Mordred. Percival and Bors shook with fear, for Mordred held up the Grail and called upon Baphomet, and his face was terrible to behold. But Dindrain stood strong and tall, a sheet of white flame. She would not budge or break. Her stillness was too much for Mordred, and his venom turned in on himself. The grain was responding to Dindrain now, not to him. It burnt his hands and boiled his brain, yet no matter how he tried, he could not release his grip. The Grail held him captive until body and soul was scorched through, and he fell into the void and was carted off to hell. Mordred's supporters scattered as Dindrain slumped exhausted on the grass. Percival and Bors rushed to her aid, then beheld a man in blue and gold vestments standing beside her, light blazing around him. "I am Prester John," he announced, "priest and king of Sarras, God's sacred city on the shores of heaven." He cleansed and blessed the Grail, then sung the dawn mass of Christmas with the standing stone as his altar. "Lux fulgebit hodie super nos," his voice rang out. "A light this day shall shine upon us." And at that moment, far to the south, Arthur looked up and was freed from insanity. Lightning cleaved the sky, and he beheld in the flash the face and form of a god. Christ, Apollo, Sol Invictus, all three rolled into one, or a completely different deity, he was not sure. but the god's might and intensity pounded through him, and he powered back to London like a supercharged Achilles, throttling Mordred's henchmen and tossing their corpses to the dogs before ripping up Baphomet's banner and raising again the imperial crown and cross. Then Baphomet dispatched a beast from hell, Tuach Truith, the boa, to rive the emperor on its tusks and lay waste the land. But Arthur slew the monster with a vicious left hook, then pursued the Mordrians to the banks of the Dart, where he slid them down like chaff. But as the sun set, the god departed, and Arthur was cut by a thorn, and was poisoned, and died. The Grail by then was far from British shores. Prester John, after Mass, had uncovered and unlocked a hidden door behind the standing stone. He led Percival, Dindrain and Bors down a subterranean staircase until they came to a torchlit tunnel and a wooden truck on rails. He handed the Grail to Dindrain, ushered them onto the truck and pushed it gently as it sped off along the tracks. "Farewell for now," he called. "A ship awaits you at the western end. We will meet again in Saras." Soon he was lost from view. The Arthurians marvelled at their strange new surroundings. "So the stories are true," gasped Bors. "We're in one of Constantine's tunnels." Burning braziers lit up a sequence of carved illustrations on both the curving walls. Biblical images to the left, from Eden to the New Jerusalem, and Roman history to the right, Aeneas in the flames of Troy, Caesar crossing the Rubicon, Constantine at the Milvian Bridge, and countless more. The truck slowed down and stopped. Blue sky and sunlight streamed through the tunnel's mouth, for it was now mid-afternoon. They stepped up onto the platform. A ship was waiting for them on the other side, and on its white sail was a picture of the Grail. Out upon the western sea they stood together on the prow, and Dindrain held the Grail aloft, singing a litany for all those dead and dying in the great schismatic war. Rain came on at dusk and continued for hours until they discerned a fragrance on the air and snippets of song from over the water. The rain curtain turned to silver glass and was rolled back like a scroll, and they saw white shores and beyond them a far green country and a shining city under a swift sunrise. Prester John was there to meet them on the sands. "The Grail is withdrawn now into heaven," he declared. "You have guarded it well, but your people no longer perceive it and you must live without it for a season. When they can recognise spiritual truth again, then will it re-emerge in your realm." So Dindrain handed him the Grail, and Prester John blessed them, breathed upon them, and called down the Holy Spirit, who descended on them in the form of a dove. Inconceivable joy burst Dindrain's heart in two, and she was lifted by invisible hands to a higher heaven. But Prester John took Percival and Bors aside, and gave them new vocations. He anointed Percival as Grail King, and sent him to Glastonbury, where he served alongside Nations the priest, keeping the legacy of the Grail alive, and praying for its blessing and eventual return. Bors was given the title of Lord Lieutenant to the new High King, Constantine IV. He returned to London and worked in tandem with Constantine to preserve as best he could what Ambrosius, Arthur and Uther had so sensationally achieved. It was a tall order and a changed world. Without the presence of the Grail to comfort and inspire, both men felt at times that Britain was drifting into sterility and spiritual winter. But Dindrain watched over them always, embedding in their hearts the forms of things unseen, and evoking the memory of that Christmas day when the light shone upon them and the real was unveiled in such astonishing, unparalleled ways.